Good morning. I want to first thank Governor Bush for inviting me to this summit. It's a true honor to contribute to your agenda. And I must also say the agenda that you are pursuing is incredibly important for the United States, but also for the world. Can I have my slides, please? Yeah. If there's one thing that we have learned over the last tough years, it's that we cannot simply bail ourselves out of an economic crisis. We cannot just stimulate our way out of an economic crisis. We cannot just print money our way out of an economic crisis. But we can do a lot better in giving more people better skills to collaborate, compete, and connect. That's what we see in the most advanced nations today. So that's what I'm going to talk about it. But we've also seen that the agenda has actually become much tougher. Last year, we conducted the world's first assessment of the skills in the workforce. This is not about schools, this is about people in work. And we found that literacy skills are a major predictor for people's employment and their wages. You are, on average, across the industrialized world, 3 times more likely to earn a good wage if you're doing well on this test than if you're doing just so-so. But the story isn't just about money. We see that there's a relationship with health, with your propensity to volunteer, to engage yourself, with your political efficacy. People at the high end of the skill distribution see themselves as actors in societies, people at the low end more as objects. And even trust, the glue in democratic societies, is closely related to the capacities and the skills of people. That's the picture on average across countries. Here you see the picture for the United States. What does this show you? This shows you that there's no country in which skills matter more for economic prosperity than in the United States. The US economy has the greatest capacity to draw out skills from people, to convert skills into better jobs and better lives of people. But the downside is that people who do not possess those skills also face much greater challenges than elsewhere. That's why it's so important to get the education agenda right. But it's become a much tougher agenda. You can solve about 80% of the tasks in many traditional school tests in seconds with the help of a smartphone. If you want your kids to become smarter than a smartphone, you have to actually think about that they're not just good in reproducing what they have learned, but in extrapolating from that, using their knowledge and skills creatively. Have a look at this. This is the demand for skills in the United States. Since the 60s and 70s, we've seen a decline in the demand for manual labor, not because those jobs got automated. Very simple. But the steepest decline in the demand for skills on the US labor market actually has been in what we call routine cognitive skills. Memorizing something and expecting that's going to help us later in life. In turn, we see a steep increase in the demand for non-routine analytic skills. That is deep content knowledge, creativity, all those problem-solving capacities, very, very important. And even social skills have seen a rise in demand. The world has rapidly changed and made it a lot tougher for education systems. The kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, are also easy to digitize, automate, and outsource. We built a test around it. The 30 most powerful economies in the world sat together at the end of the 90s to see how well school systems around the world do in equipping their citizens with those critical skills for tomorrow's world. Here you see a map of the countries that have done that so far. It's about 65 countries for which we have now comparable data. Soon it's going to be over 80. And they represent, almost 90% of the world economy. So actually, if we don't get the education agenda right in those countries, we're in deep trouble. They take this test, which is quite different from what you see in a typical school test. Most tasks are open, and the students have to create knowledge, not just reproduce knowledge. And then we also collect a lot of data from parents, from teachers, from principals, from administrators, because they all have something to say about the results that we see. Very, very important part of this assessment. It's not just about, data about students. It's about triangulating across the different perspectives of stakeholders. Well, let me show you something about results. The first point I want to really make is that the best performing education systems are actually able to achieve excellence for students from all socioeconomic backgrounds. In fact, our data show that there is no policy trade-off between excellence and equity. Here you see the performance of nations. You know, red is sort of below OECD average, yellow is so-so, and green are the countries that do really well. That's sort of Common Core standards territory. It's really where students do well. And you can see, you know, countries like Singapore in Asia, Hong Kong, Shanghai in China, they are about 3.5 years ahead of the average at the age of 15. And the gap that you see here on the total slide is about the equivalent of 6 school years. There's an enormous difference in the capacity of education systems to develop talent at the age of 15. Enormous differences. The United States is sort of in the middle, but actually at the lower end of the middle. And part of the reason is that it has a long trail of poorly performing students. We estimated the economic cost of this, and we got a number around 72 trillion US dollars that the US economy loses over the lifetime of students today because it doesn't get everybody to achieve at least minimum standards. You've just come out actually quite successfully of the economic recession, but what you're talking here is about the equivalent of a permanent economic recession. That's the amount of money. Of course, the picture is not uniform. You know, you have a state like Massachusetts that does actually really well. That's the top performing state according to PISA, but even there is room for improvement. But I want to introduce a second dimension into the picture, and that is how well do education systems leverage the talent of disadvantaged students. On the left side, you will see countries where social background has a large impact on outcomes, where opportunities are unequally distributed. On the right side, I'm showing you countries that are much better in moderating social inequality. Of course, when you look at this chart, everybody wants to be there where performance is great and no disparities. Nobody wants to be there where performance is poor or so-so and there's a large achievement gap. But often educators ask themselves, you know, is it better to do well and accept disparities, or better on focus on equity and accept mediocrity? The interesting thing, as I mentioned before, this trade-off doesn't exist. No? Massachusetts does well. It's a price of large disparities, but you can see there are many countries in the green quadrant in every corner of the world. No? Your northern neighbor, Canada, does actually really well, even for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Many of the great successes in education today in Asia. Very important. Quality and equity are not opposing policy objectives. I want to put a last part into this diagram, and that's money. The size of the dot that you're seeing here represents spending per student. The larger the bubble, the more invested per student up to the age of 15 years. No? If money would tell you everything about the quality of an education system, you'd find all the large bubbles at the top and all the small bubbles at the bottom. No? But that's not what you see. In fact, spending per student explains less than 20% of the performance differences across the industrialized world. How countries invest their money matters a lot more. Look at Luxembourg, the most expensive education system in the world. It does neither well on average, nor does it succeed in educating children from disadvantaged backgrounds. The United States is the 4th largest spender on OECD, but it also is just doing so-so. So money alone doesn't guarantee success. Let's look behind that. This chart shows you the share of educational spending relative to GDP that actually makes it to the classroom. You know, only money that ends up in the classroom in instructional services actually has a chance to contribute to better outcomes. And you can see that you can spend that money very differently. One way in which you can spend money is to pay teachers well. Now, that's what the Koreans do. No? They try to really pay very attractive salaries, at least for teachers who demonstrate great performance. Salaries are high, cost you money. They also want their students to learn for long hours. They pay for that. That's the white bars going up further. And the Koreans don't want their teachers only to teach, they also want their teachers to continue learning. They invest in teacher collaboration, professional development. Nice to say, but it costs them money. You can see how this bar goes up and up and up and up. So you ask yourself, how do the Koreans actually pay for that? And the answer is, their students sit in large classes. No? They make a very clear trade-off. They prioritize the quality of teaching over the size of classes. Let's go to the next country on the list, Luxembourg. The red dot is exactly where it is for Korea. So the Luxembourg system spends as much per student as the Korea does. But you can see they spend their money very differently. Parents and teachers all like small classes. That's what's driving costs upwards, but even Luxembourg can spend its money only once. No. And that means the price for this is actually short school days, lower salaries, and teachers have little time to do other things than teaching. Let's look at another couple of countries. Finland, or the United States. What you suddenly see here is that Finland and Korea are two very different education systems, two very different cultures, but they spend their money quite similarly. And the United States is a lot more like Luxembourg than like Finland or Korea. This is, of course, a very crude analysis, but we've done a lot more research on this, and we find consistently that if you have to make the choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, go for the better teacher. Let's go back to this. This is how the world looks. Some people say, this is all about culture or socioeconomic context. Some countries have more immigrants, are more diverse, have more child poverty, all those kinds of things. Actually, this is just a very small part of the explanation. And for example, if you say the United States has more child poverty than other industrialized nations, it's not true. The United States has more immigrants. Well, it was true a while ago. Today, there are many countries struggling with very similar challenges. So social and economic context is just a part of the equation. And the most powerful argument that this is so is actually when you look at changes over time. If you look at the United States, actually, it has not stood still over the last decade. You can actually see it has moved. States like Florida have been very successful in closing some of the achievement gap, leveraging performance of lower disadvantaged students. And you could see the United States actually moving into the right direction, closing some of the achievement gap. But it hasn't moved upwards. Whereas other countries have. Look at Shanghai in China. They have moved beyond the screen. You can't see them anymore. Singapore, raising performance. It's the best performing education systems that keep on moving fast. But even at the bottom of the scale, nobody thinks about Turkey when you think about education. But look what they have achieved. They've been able to close achievement gap and significantly raise performance. And the dot has been small. They have not much money. My country, Germany, was very much shocked by the outcome that social disparities were overriding everything. Half of the achievement gap has been closed. They didn't change their culture. They didn't change the socioeconomic context. They actually got more immigrants rather than less over the last decade. Still, were able to close a significant share of the achievement gap. Italy, another country, raising performance, improving equity. Poland, a great success story, not so much on the equity front, but in raising performance across the entire spectrum of the school system. Or Portugal. There's a lot that has happened. Unfortunately, these are the countries with the most significant changes. Many education systems have stood rather still. But it's an argument that, we're not talking about culture, we're talking about what people do and how they do that. Last point on this. The country where students go to class matters a lot more than what social class students come from. Let me show you this. This looks a bit complicated, but it's actually very instructive. What I've done here is I've ordered student performance by decile of social background. So the red dot that you see here are the 10% of the most disadvantaged, poorest Mexican students. And they do a lot worse than the 10% of the most privileged students. If you look to Chile, actually, if you are disadvantaged in Chile, you do worse than in Mexico. If you are privileged in Chile, you do better than in Mexico. So what you see already here is that, children from very similar backgrounds perform very differently in different school systems. And now you can do that for the rest of the world. And you can see actually how large the performance gap is and the performance differences of students who have exactly the same social background. Look at Shanghai in China. The 10% of the most disadvantaged students in China, and they usually are students from immigrant families. They live in, not in proper housing. Their parents work as construction workers. They have a really tough time. But they do as well as the richest kids in many other countries, including the United States. I think what these data show us that poverty doesn't need to be destiny. It just shows us what is possible, how well even the most challenged children can do if they face the right educational context. We're going to talk about this in a bit more while. I want to make a last point. You know, actually, yesterday in many of the discussions, it seems that low performance in the United States is all a matter of figuring out which schools are not doing so well and fixing them. True, that is part of the equation. But in fact, we're not talking about just poor kids in poor neighborhoods. In fact, some of the most disappointing results of the PISA assessment happen actually in schools in quite well-off neighborhoods. They do reasonably well in absolute terms, but they actually underperform by a large margin when you compare them with schools in similar contexts elsewhere. Here you see the share of top performers. You can see again in Shanghai, in China, 50% of the students really can work with very complex mathematical situations. They have a deep understanding of mathematical concepts. They can work strategically with advanced thinking and reasoning skills. Massachusetts is doing well on that, but actually trails quite a bit behind this. And while a state like Florida has been enormously successful in closing the achievement gap, if you look at actually at the top end of the distribution, there's a lot actually room for improvement. So actually, we're not just talking about poor kids in poor neighborhoods in here. Why is the top end of the distribution so important? Well, actually, I come back to our assessment of adult skills. This is not PISA, this is the workforce. We can actually see that there has been a steep decline in the employment of people with just so-so skills. No? If you have medium-level skills, actually, you see this is where the job losses happen these days. If you have very low skills, and this sounds funny, no? You're actually better off in terms of employment than with average skills. Why? Because the US economy and most industrialist economies have actually a lot of jobs that do not require advanced skills. They pay you less and less for those jobs, but actually they exist. But the only employment growth that we have seen is actually for workers with advanced skills. So it's really important to get both ends of the skills spectrum right. So the last point I want to make is that I talked about social background, but in fact, most of the performance differences you can explain with how mathematics is taught in a field like mathematics. One way in which you can teach mathematics is by embedding simple mathematics in complex contexts and teaching students one problem after the next. Word problems, we call them. I must say, this was the mathematics I hated most when I was in school, because all you had to do is extract the numbers from the board, solve the problem, and then do it. Look at Luxembourg. That's actually the most common way in which they teach. The United Kingdom would be another country. What's interesting, look at some of the strongest performing countries, Shanghai in China, Vietnam, and so on. They don't teach mathematics in this way. There's another way in which you can teach mathematics, and that is focus on conceptual understanding, making sure that students have a deep understanding. What does probability mean? What does a mathematical relationship mean? And you can see this doesn't happen in Luxembourg, but in some of the top performing countries, that's what they do. So once again, what we are talking about when we look at international comparisons is not, the economic or the context and so on. It has a lot to do with how we educate children. So what can you do about all of this? I want to order the things by their impact on outcomes. And of course, you always need to take into account the economic and political cost of reform. No? Everybody wants to do things that are easy to do and not so expensive. No? They're very important. Nobody wants to do things that are actually very hard to do and not so important. No? Sounds obvious, but you look in education over the last 10, 15 years, actually a lot of money got spent on things that are actually not so powerful. You want to move the agenda forward doing things that are really important, but hard to do. And you can always pick up some low-hanging fruits that are maybe not so important, but easy to do. So let me just sort of put the factors that we have found associated with performance into this map. And I want to start with something that sounds simple, but is actually very, very hard to do. And that is to achieve a universal commitment to achievement. Chinese parents and grandparents will invest the last money they have into the education of their children. They invest in their future. In the Western world, we have started to spend the money of our children to finance consumption today. That's actually a good illustration of what we are actually seeing today. And actually, this is something, the value countries place on education is a big part of their performance on international assessments like this. It has to do with the way in which countries spell out expectations. Now, one of the strengths of Asia is that they expect every child to succeed. They have high expectations for every student. Universal education standards, high degree of adapting learning to the needs of students. As a teacher, you will lose face if one or two of your students in your class fail. Very important. But it's not just about high expectations. It's also, and that's a very important part, the belief that every student can succeed. And you'll be surprised, you can see those beliefs mirrored in the mindset of students. Once we asked children, 15-year-olds, a simple question. We asked them, what do you believe will make you successful in mathematics? And the majority of students in the United States would typically tell you, oh, that's clear, this is about talent. If I'm not born as a genius, I better study something else. So the belief, I do not own my success. The education system is just sorting me. If you ask that same question to a Chinese or Singaporean students, 9 out of 10 tell you, if I try really, really hard, I trust my teachers are going to help me and I'm going to be successful. And they do succeed. So this belief that all children can succeed is not just a belief held by teachers. You can see that mirrored in the mindset of our children. Let me show you some data on that. We call this mathematics self-efficacy, but it's the same kind of concept. And you can see actually this is a big predictor of success within a country, particularly for disadvantaged students. And it's also a predictor across countries. No? Shanghai, China comes out right on top, both in terms of performance and in terms of the belief of students that they own their success, that effort and work will actually make it difficult. Some people ask, how high should expectations be? Wouldn't we harm students at some point? Will there be sort of a curve that turns down at some point? We haven't found that today. Actually, the highest expectations combined with the best support are linear related to learning outcomes. Let me show you the mirror picture of this. We ask students also, who is to blame when things go wrong? Here you have France compared with China. In France, the students often say, well, I didn't do well because I was unlucky. The teacher didn't get me interested in the material. The course material was too hard. I just made bad guesses on the test. So they blame everyone except themselves. Very important, the mirror image of that. Does it matter? Do those beliefs matter? You have seen they matter in terms of performance, but they also matter in terms of gender differences. Actually, one of the things that we see is that basically the girls have much lower beliefs in their own mathematical abilities. Somehow education systems convey to them the sense that they own their success less than the boys do. If we would succeed actually in evening that out, in giving every student, boy or girl, the same sense of ownership in mathematics, we would no longer see any differences in mathematics performance across countries. Very important finding. And those things actually matter for the future. In one way, education around the world has been quite successful. Most of the gender differences in performance have been sort of ironed out. Boys and girls do at least much more similar now than in the past. But actually, if you look at who goes to college to study what, you can see there remain huge differences still today. And you can see they are explained more by the sense of ownership than by their actual performance. You can see that here. This is the percentage of girls and boys who say that they intend to take additional math rather than language. And in most countries, those things are very uneven still. I want to come to a second factor that is also very important, and that is that high-performing countries have clear ambitions of what they want to achieve. They have high-stakes gateways and instructional systems. In the United States, I often hear, if you have a high-stakes gateway, a high-stakes test, you are actually widening disparities. You're penalizing people. Our data show exactly the opposite. The higher the stakes for students, the more equitable the education system, because all students have understood what matters. Parents, students, teachers have understood what matters. That's what you can see in the most best-performing education systems. They also have a well-established delivery chains to which those instructional goals actually translate into teaching practice. Teachers understand what those goalposts mean and what they need to do about it. In some countries, that's actually very impressive to see. A third point I want to make, and this is the toughest part of the agenda, this is building capacity in classrooms in schools. I put this very much to the left on the chart because this is really, really difficult to do. This has to do with, on the one hand, attracting top candidates into the profession. No country beats Finland on this. They get 9 applicants for every teaching post. Everybody wants to become a teacher, despite moderate pay, not because it's such an interesting environment to work. Really interesting work organization. It's about supporting teachers. It's about retaining and recognizing good performance. I'm going to show you some data on that. And finally, it's about improving the value of teaching in society. Let me show you some data on that. We did the largest survey of teachers around the world a year ago, and we asked teachers, what do they believe society thinks about them? And if you live in Malaysia, in Singapore, or Korea, and so on, you can actually see that the vast majority of teachers see their status very high. They believe society really values their work. If you get to the United States, there's only about 1/3 of the teachers that feel that their job is sort of recognized in society. If you get to France, it's only 5 in 100. And now you can say, well, this is just teachers complaining. Does it really matter? But actually, if you line those data up with the PISA results, you can see there is a relationship. It's not so clear what the cause or nature is. It could well be that where teachers do a great job, like in Finland, society will value them. But it could also be that where society places a great value on education and on teachers, you'll attract the most talented people into teaching, and they end up in the classrooms. Very important. How do teachers learn? We found that actually effective teacher collaboration is a very powerful way of people to work together. On the one hand, we see that actually teachers exchange a lot of information every day. Now, that's happening quite frequently. But when we talk about the kind of professional collaboration that really enhances pedagogical practice, it is actually quite rare. In some countries, it's more pronounced than in others, but in most countries, it's actually quite rare. But I want to show you an example of Singapore, one of the high-performing education systems. How do teachers learn in Singapore? Well, they observe each other classroom on a regular basis, and they talk about the results, and they use technology to facilitate this. Listen to this.
To do that, really we get teachers to work together, to collaborate, and to look at each other's practice in the classroom. I think that is essential and really very critical, because the good teaching practices should not reside within the 4 walls and be kept to one teacher, and I think there is a lot of sharing that we can have in this school.
What you want to do right now is, think of the Socratic questions, what do I want to use to further define, clarify? Now, I will go on the internet, I will find any sort of evidence that will help support this statement or refute this.
Professional learning community in schools was started basically to ensure that teachers had a platform to develop their teaching practices. Our main focus actually is to make sure that students learn best. And in order to do that, we have to collaborate. We exchange ideas, we try out, we test, and eventually we check for results. And the intention really is to share ideas to make it better for the students.
What's really interesting, when you look to a country like Singapore, they have really moved teaching from an art to a science. Actually, so they've studied very systematically what makes teaching great, and they work together to find out and build that kind of professional practice. We asked teachers also, where do they need more professional development? Teaching students with special needs comes out first. You know, that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue as populations becoming more diverse. Technology, very high on the agenda. That's on average across countries. In the United States, actually, teachers express less need for professional development than other nations. One interpretation is they know all of those things already. The other interpretation is they have a lower set of aspirations. These data do not tell us, but look at this. The Japanese and Korean teachers come out first in terms of the need expressed for improvement. And what you saw before is actually they do quite well, but they want to become better every day. If you look to England, United States, teachers say, well, you know, I know more or less what I need to do. The same on pedagogical competences. No? The Korean teachers come out first in terms of, I want to improve my pedagogical skills. In England, the United States is almost 0% of the teachers. Content knowledge. That's certainly something where Korea beats almost every other country. No? They're very, very strong. They're not so great on competence-based learning, but they do actually well on content. Still, they want to become better. In Spain, 0%. So these data tell us something about, you know, probably the aspirations that teachers have. Where do they see the limit of their performance? Very important. How to learn teachers about their own work? You know, when you hear, listen to the media, there seems to be a sense, you know, we have too many assessments, too many teacher feedback, too many appraisal systems. And that's in fact what often we hear, but when we survey teachers, they tell us exactly the opposite. The majority of teachers say that they lack good feedback, that they do not know about where to learn from their better practices. In fact, we have only half of the teachers saying that they get feedback on their teaching from 1 or 2 sources. Many teachers feel working in isolation in their classroom. And in fact, when it comes to multiple sources of feedback, which is so important for improvement, it's actually a small minority of teachers. Why do I say that? Because, in fact, feedback is what helps, and evaluation help changing behavior. You can see this on average. You can see this in the United States. It's about the personal behavior. It's about the pedagogical and the professional aspects. All of those benefit from better feedback. Very, very important. What are the consequences of feedback? A development or training plan is established. That's true in the United States for half of the teachers, or a bit more. But look at this. The best performing teachers in the school receive the greatest recognition. I guess you would want every teacher to actually believe that. It's only 40%. If you get to Korea or Singapore or Poland, virtually 80% of the teachers, double that ratio. The idea that your teaching is valued and that better performance actually links to greater recognition. One of the biggest complaints that we get from teachers all around the world is that teaching is in a profession where you can work as hard as you want and nothing happens. Or you can consistently underperform and nothing happens. That's something that we see in many of the OECD countries. Last point I want to make on teachers very quickly is, you know, coming back to class size. Well, even if you can demonstrate that, you know, class size doesn't, smaller classes don't improve outcomes, people still think that it makes teachers happy. No? But we actually looked at this. Class size and job satisfaction. No relationship. Teachers are as happy in small classes as they are in large classes. What makes a difference is behavioral problems. So discipline and those things actually relate very, very closely to teacher job satisfaction. Well, I want to sort of go briefly through a couple of other points. One has to do with incentive structures and accountability. I put it very much sort of to the right side because it's actually quite easy to do. But what we have seen is that whereas the United States puts a lot of accountability on schools, it actually has relatively little accountability on individual students. Not many sort of high-stakes gateways. Not many levers to get students to study things that are actually hard to study rather than just pick the courses that are easiest. For teachers, to make innovations in pedagogy, to improve your own performance, but also the performance of your colleagues, and to pursue professional development that is not just fixing short-term skill gaps, but actually leads to stronger educational practice. Going back to Shanghai, those teachers spent 240 hours over the first 3 years to actually improve practice. In Singapore, 100 hours every year. A lot of investments. It's also about the right balance between vertical accountability, moving information upwards, and horizontal accountability, working with your peers and other schools. Very important part. Let me show you a couple of data points on this. When you think about the United States, you think about local control. Schools have a lot of room for discretion. No? Actually, we measured that. And what we see, what our data show, is actually, the United States just comes out actually slightly below the average. Far behind countries. When you think about Japan, you think about a giant ministry in Tokyo controlling every school. But in fact, the Japanese schools are #1 in terms of the relative discretion that they give their schools to make decisions. The Netherlands. Every school is a charter school. There's a very, very strong accountability system and a very good knowledge management system. And the government is actually very good in inspecting schools and figuring out, schools that don't do their job. But schools, you can open up a school very quickly. The UK. It's not so clear what to read out of this chart because you can see Shanghai is like the United States, is not giving their schools a lot of discretion, but it's doing actually a lot better. So you can't equate school autonomy with better outcomes automatically. It gets a lot more complex. Let me show you this. If you live in an education system where there is no shared understanding of what good mathematics performance is, you actually see that school autonomy works against you. The schools which have more autonomy, but that do not operate in a context where every school knows what good performance really means, actually perform worse. But if you have a clear set of, a shared vision of what good performance is, school autonomy becomes a predictor of better outcomes. Another point. If you are in a school system with a very limited degree of transparency, school autonomy works against you. The more autonomous schools, the worse. But if you work in a system where schools know what other schools know and parents know what other schools do, you can see how strongly school autonomy becomes a predictor for success. Last point on this. If school autonomy means, the principal decides on everything, but actually teachers are not involved in those decision-making processes, school autonomy works against you. But if you have a system of distributed leadership, you can actually see how schools' autonomy becomes a predictor of success. So it's not autonomy or not autonomy. It's often about the context in which that is actually realized. Now I come back to the United States. Local control, it actually exists, but it's all at the level of school districts. When you get to the front line of education delivery, it's a lot more limited. Why is that important? Because our data show that that is the only level that relates to better outcomes. Doesn't really matter. You have centralized education systems that do well. You have state-level education systems, federal systems that do really well. The only area that predicts outcomes is the school level. I want to just show you how this also relates to quality assurance. Singapore is a country that gets virtually everything right. They implement a standardized policy for mathematics. Schools know what good mathematics is. They regularly consult with outside experts. Every new coming teacher gets mentored by senior colleagues. They have very impressive career structures in Singapore. A school leader in Singapore, you don't become a school leader at the age of 40 or 50. At the end of your career, actually, the first day you enter the school, they try to figure out, what are your talent for? Is it curriculum development? Is it instructional practice? Is it leadership? And they're going to invest in the people to build those kinds of careers. They recognize good performance, they reward good performance, they do external evaluation, internal evaluation. So here you see a country that has a consistent and coherent approach to quality assurance. One more important point, and that is the capacity of countries to invest resources where they matter most. One of the things that we see, particularly in the East Asian countries, but also in Northern Europe, those countries are very, very good to attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms, to get the best principals into the toughest schools. How do they do that? They cannot control that. They cannot send people there. But typically by modeling career structures in terms of challenges. If you're a vice principal in a high-performing school in Shanghai in China, and one day you say, You want to become principal in the school. The education ministry tells you, right, that's a great ambition, but first help us turn around one of the lowest performing schools. And we're not leaving you alone. You can actually take some of your best teachers with you. They pair high and low performing schools, and at the end of the day, actually they achieve amazing levels of improvement by tying resources to the challenges with very, very good incentive structures. They also make effective spending choices. We talked about this already. Just a couple of data points on that. On the horizontal axis, you see not how much countries spend, but how equitably they invest their resources. If you're on the right side, like Finland, there's actually a lot of resources and better resources going into the toughest schools. Actually, one of the interesting findings is many countries, and you see this in the United States as well, have started to give lower performing schools more teachers. But that's not the problem. It's getting the better teachers into those schools. That's what we see in some of the countries, as you can see on this chart. In the United States, it's sort of at the other end of that spectrum. We can also see that in the teacher distribution, you have much greater shortage of qualified teachers, not of numbers, of qualified teachers in disadvantaged schools than in the most privileged schools. Big area to really work on. School choice. Big topic of this, and in fact you can say the Netherlands, Flanders, are the models of school choice. Some of the best performing education systems in the world have actually made school choice work. But there are also education systems that have not got that to work, where there are very strong charter schools, but also very, very poorly performing charter schools. So what distinguishes the former group from the latter? Well, the former group enabled parents to make choices. Every parent can figure out, what methodology, what pedagogy is right for my child. But the governments take responsibility also that parents have good choices, and they have very effective means to deal with underperformance. England has made 60% of its schools over a very narrow period of time, 10 years, less than 10 years. 60% of their schools they have made converted into charter schools of their secondary schools. But they also have built a very powerful inspection system that looks after every school and identifies failure early on. Here are the levers that we have found related to choice. You can opt for systems of control choice. You can work with financial incentives, works very well. You can give them to schools, or you can give them to parents. Both systems work quite effectively. You can put your bet on parent, dealing with the information asymmetry that we have all in school systems. How do parents actually know what choices to make? There's some really impressive examples in those countries. You can actually ensure that teachers and schools collaborate, and you can use student assessment tools. But without those kinds of instruments, there's great risk that actually school choice leads just to more variability, but not to more better improvement of the system. This is, I think, a big lesson we can learn from the best performing system. Very, very last point is about coherence. Is to ensure that what we do is actually coherent across the system. Early education, school, access to higher education really need to be linked together. It's about ensuring coherence over sustained periods of time. It's about consistency of implementation. Often intended policies do not translate into implemented and achieved policies. Very important. So when you actually sum that all up, you can basically see that what distinguishes the best performing education systems from the rest is that they have actually made success possible for all of their children. They basically leverage the talent of all of their children. They have high expectations. They have moved from a system where only some students succeed to one where all students succeed. They do not work in a culture of compliance and sort of conformity, but they embrace diversity. They have differentiated education systems where teachers actually embrace that kind of diversity. They have moved from an approach that is curriculum-centered, prescriptive, to one where actually teachers shape pedagogical practice. They're no longer operating in learning being a place, but making learning an activity, integrating what happens at home and what happens at school. They have shifted the focus from the provision of education to the outcomes. Shifted the focus from looking upwards in the school bureaucracy to looking outwards to the next school, to the next teacher, and so on. I think what international comparisons really show is that success as possible. We can combine excellence and equity. We can do that with reasonable levels of cost. And we have seen an enormous amount of change in the right direction across the world. Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage New Mexico Secretary of Education, Hannah Scandera.
Good morning, and good morning. Well, I was sitting in my chair thinking we should have titled your presentation and talk, Busting the Myths. And then I thought we should just take you on the road to every city across America and start sharing the truth and putting it on the line. It was very compelling. So, yeah. So there's so many things that you unpacked, so many myths that you busted in a short amount of time. I want to hit rewind and go back and ask a couple questions if you'd unpack them a little bit. Here in the US, we have islands of excellence we can point to, but they're really in the midst of a sea of mediocrity. And at the end of the day, how do we actually scale excellence in a meaningful way for each and every one of our students, not just for islands here and there?
You know, it starts always uniform and consistent expectations for students. Where we actually level down the horizon for students, we get mediocre performance. And one of the things that struck me most, actually, we did an analysis, this was not in the latest PISA, but in one generation before, where we looked at the relationship between school marks and PISA performance. And one of the things that we saw is that many students actually in the US get good marks, even if their performance isn't that great, at least by OECD standards. So students are told actually they're doing fine if they're not doing well. And the most troubling part is that actually the most disadvantaged students have the biggest discrepancy between the marks they get and the outcomes they achieve. And that is sort of, I think, one important element. The other element is how you actually build capacity for sharing knowledge throughout the system, how you connect teachers in the system, how you actually connect schools throughout the system, how you actually build markets of schools that actually function, rather than schools keeping the good practices for themselves. And I think that has to do, I think what good education systems do, they put a lot of responsibility on schools, and they put a lot of autonomy on schools and a lot of possibilities for parents to make choices, but they also operate on the supply side of the market. They basically figure out, how can we get great teachers in hard-to-staff schools? How can we actually build coherence across the system? How can we deal with underperforming charter schools? This is something I'm really surprised. I haven't really seen consistently done in the United States, sort of tackling underperformance at the level of the system.
In the midst of that, how much, you talked a lot about teacher quality, expectations, the teaching profession. What about school leadership? Where does the school leader come into the mix of this in regards, especially with the local autonomy? What's the balance there?
Absolutely. This is hard to measure, actually. It's very hard to quantify leadership qualities, but it's absolutely well known that, nothing works without a great leader in the school. School autonomy is actually counterproductive without having leaders that are instruction leaders, not bureaucrats who manage a school, but actually people who develop the human potential in the school, who bring teachers together to collaborate. I mean, one impressive system for this to see is Japan. Teachers work together to prepare lessons, they evaluate lessons, they observe each other's classrooms, they learn from each other with each other. Why do they do that? Not because they're different people, but because they have school leaders who know this kind of business.
You talked a lot about, and we have many times we run into a presupposition here in the United States that poverty, income gaps, are the reason our students are not performing. But I want to add another to that mix. You talked about mindsets and expectations. You talked about aligning home life and our expectations in school. What about parents? And what's the role of parents when it comes to, and how influential? We all assume that if a student doesn't come, or we hear, I should say, when a student doesn't come from a home that has those expectations, how can we expect them to perform in school? Can you talk a little bit about the importance of parents on the one hand, but also is there a myth to bust there in that can students actually come from a home that's really tough and still excel?
Yeah, the United States unfortunately didn't take part in the PISA parent survey. It's a great loss. I would really encourage you to do that in the next round because you learn so much from the parent perspective. The one thing that struck me most is that it is a lot less a question of, you know, what academic degree you have as a parent or how much time you spend on the homework with your children. The simple question, you know, that parents ask their children consistently, you know, how was school today? Showing an interest in what the children do at school is predicting more of the performance gap than the social background of the children. So it's a lot that parents can actually do to actually leverage this. Now, you know, that puts the sort of responsibility on parents, but there's a lot school systems can do actually to actually get parents to be involved. The most extreme example, you know, I was visiting one of the poorest provinces in China recently, and I couldn't believe the good performance standards. So I wanted to actually understand what's going on there. And, you know, they had children, the first generation of children who were educated. Their parents even didn't want their children to be in school. You know, better to work at home than to go to this institution that we don't know. Teachers calling parents twice per week to give them an understanding of what happens in the school. So there's a lot of parental engagement in this. You can see this across Asia, where actually teachers have high expectations for students, but they also have a high degree of pastoral care. They really feel responsible for the well-being of their students and the parents. Another example in Sweden. At the end of the school year, you know, you don't just get a school mark, bad or good, but actually every teacher sits together with every student and their parents to discuss, you know, what has gone well, what has not gone well. And the golden rule in this is really interesting. You know, the only thing you're not allowed to do is to complain about the other. You know, the teachers are not allowed to complain about the students, the parents about the teachers. Everybody has to say, what can I do to make things better? And this is how parents, students, and teachers are tied together to pursue better performance. It's a lot, I think, school systems can do to leverage the goodwill and interest of parents. And it's not a question of the academic sort of preparation of parents, but of their interest in what happens. And that's actually, again, we have a really great data set on that, but unfortunately the US didn't take that.
Little encouragement there, not so subtle. Quick question on that front. As we think about, I was thinking, I don't know if I should be encouraged or depressed as we look at the myths that are being busted as you were speaking, but what are we doing right here in the United States? When you looked at the PISA data and as you've done your research, what are the things that you see are working, we should keep doing, build on them in the midst of a lot of things that we can improve in?
I think, you know, most of educational innovation has been born in the United States. In fact, I think the US is the biggest exporter of great pedagogical practice, you know. If you go to Singapore, it's a great place to go, you know. You go to see what's happening in classroom, use of technology, all of innovation. You know, a lot has been actually taken from the United States. The policy of Shanghai to tie higher performing with lower performing schools, actually they copied that from New York, but, you know, they made it work consistently. And I think they were... I think that it's consistently of implementation. I think the innovation, the innovative capacity of the US education system is absolutely fantastic. I think there's so much potential. There's so many great schools. And you know, when you have averages like this in PISA, they may look disappointing. But you have a great number of schools who achieve amazing results. The problem is, how do you make the system know about those schools? How do you make other teachers learn about it? And when you come back, you look at the profile of teachers. Your choice in the United States to put all the premium on smaller classes has actually meant that teachers are not particularly well paid. It has meant that actually teachers have very little time to do other things than teaching. So actually teachers have very little room to actually build pedagogical practice. And I think that's where innovation doesn't really spread as well as it does in other nations now.
So you've talked a lot about the PISA exam. I have to jump to a hot topic, and that is, what about here in the US, we're having a really strong, for lack of a better way of saying it, backlash to testing. And what are your observations as you look internationally about tests, how they're used, and the receptivity and amount? What are you seeing as you do comparisons there?
It's a good question. You know, one of the things that I've heard also yesterday, but over many years here, is that people say, well, the US kids are the most tested kids in the world. I can assure you that's not true. Actually,
and I'll take that home.
Probably there's more externally administered tests. In many other countries, there would be a greater share of the tests that are developed at the school level within a framework and so on. Perhaps there's also differences in how test results are used to actually feed improvement. I think you would have a greater emphasis on, you know, using information to inform parents, to inform students, than just sort of moving it up in the bureaucracy. But I don't think actually the diagnostic part is outweighing. I mean, One thing I think all education systems can become better is to more closely integrate the process of learning and assessment. Often we have this idea, assessment takes time away from learning. The opposite is true, actually. Again, the countries with the greatest stakes on assessment are some of the best performers in the world. You cannot improve what you cannot measure in some ways and communicate to people. So I don't think the volume of testing in the US is exceptional, particularly high. The nature of the assessment, that's a judgment I make now, but I think there's a lot of emphasis on the kind of multiple choice tests that are maybe not as productive, too little on really good assessment that actually go into depths into capturing what students think, how students think about things. I think there's a lot of work that can be done to improve things, but overall I think, without good assessment, some people say Finland doesn't do assessment. In fact, I do not know where this myth comes from, because actually we ask teachers, we ask students, we ask school principals, and the amount of assessment in Finland is quite comparable to that in the United States. No?
Terrific. One last question. You've looked at a lot of data. What stands out to you most? What is the most, maybe the aha for you in the piece of data that you've looked at in particular? Well,
over time, it's, of course, I do not want to deny the effect of poverty and disadvantage on outcomes. I think you can see this everywhere. But the fact that some countries are so much better than others in moderating the impact of poverty. Now, you can't make poor families rich overnight, but what you can do, and that's what these results very clearly show, is that you can moderate and in some countries almost eliminate this effect. Again, remember that the 10% of the most disadvantaged kids in Shanghai outperform their most privileged peers in the rest of the industrialized world. I think it's a very powerful kind of symbol that actually we could do so much better with that.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Dr. Schleicher. This has been enlightening, so we appreciate it.